Prima woke up with a violent jerk as Papa Timmy's frightened shout tore through the silence of the mansion like a blade slicing through cloth, and her heart began to pound so hard it felt as if it wanted to escape her chest, because somewhere deep inside her soul she already knew that the nightmare she had paid for had not gone as planned. And as she slowly dragged her trembling feet toward the window, every step felt heavier than the last, as though the house itself was trying to stop her from seeing the truth. But when she finally parted the curtain, her breath disappeared completely, because there in the glowing moonlight of the compound stood Chief Abikimi, dirty, exhausted, thin, wounded, but undeniably alive. And that single sight shattered everything she had been dreaming about, because this was the man she had secretly paid millions to never see again. The man she had planned to erase so she could be free. And yet fate had dragged him back like a curse that refused to be broken. Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone and checked her messages again and again, desperately hoping the kidnappers would explain what had gone wrong. But there was nothing, no calls, no text, no confirmation, only silence, and the silence screamed louder than any words ever could, because she had already transferred 2 million naira as advance payment for his death. And yet the job was left unfinished, and anger mixed with fear as she realized that a living husband was more dangerous to her than a dead one. But there was no time to panic, because Papa, Timmy, and the servants were already rushing toward Abikimi. So she wiped her face, forced her lips to shake, rubbed her eyes until they were red, loosened her hair, and quickly changed into a modest nightgown, transforming herself into the image of a suffering wife before stepping outside with loud dramatic cries that fooled everyone. As she ran toward Abikimi, screaming his name like a woman who had almost lost her soul, wrapping her arms around him and burying her face into his chest, even though her tears were not born from love but from rage that her dark plan had collapsed right in front of her, while Abikimi, weak and confused, stood stiffly in her embrace, still too traumatized by his captivity to notice that the woman holding him had once ordered his execution. And as servants carried him inside and doctors were called, Prima continued her performance flawlessly, shouting instructions, demanding hot water, food, medicine, and prayers, earning praise from everyone who saw her as a devoted wife, even though inside her heart she was boiling with hatred toward the kidnappers who had failed her and toward the man who had returned to ruin her future. And over the next few days she became the perfect nurse, feeding Abikimi, wiping his sweat, sitting beside his bed, smiling sweetly, asking about his pain, all while secretly planning how to divorce him, steal what she could, and escape with her hidden lover, Faye, because in her mind this marriage was a prison that had robbed her of her youth and happiness, while Abikimi, unaware of her betrayal, thanked God every day for bringing him back alive and giving him such a caring wife, telling her how he had thought death was waiting for him in that dark building, how he had prayed to see her again, and how grateful he was to be home. Words that would have broken a good woman's heart, but only made Prima feel more trapped and far away behind a quiet smile and patient eyes. Tambra watched everything unfold like a predator watching injured prey, knowing that no crime remains hidden forever and that evil always circles back to the one who created it. And while the mansion slowly returned to normal, fate was already sharpening its knife, preparing to strike, because the woman who had tried to bury her husband alive was about to be dragged into a nightmare, far darker than anything she had ever imagined. For the next 5 days after Chief Abakimi's return, Prima became the picture of a loving wife, moving through the mansion with soft steps and gentle words, while hiding a heart that was harder than stone. Because every smile she gave him was a lie, and every cup of medicine she handed him felt like another chain tightening around her own neck. And although the servants praised her endlessly for her devotion, she knew the truth, that she was only acting, playing a role so perfectly that even she sometimes forgot it was fake. As Abakimi lay on his bed, recovering from the nightmare of his kidnapping, telling her in a weak but grateful voice how he had been locked in darkness, how the smell of cement and urine had almost driven him mad, and how he had prayed every night to see her face again, unaware that the very woman holding his hands had once sent him into that darkness. And each time he thanked her for standing by him, guilt tried to creep into her heart, but she crushed it quickly, reminding herself that she deserved a better life than this aging chief who controlled everything she touched. Because long before Abakimi was kidnapped, her heart had already left him and run into the arms of Faye, the handsome, charming man who promised her a new future filled with passion, freedom, and wealth. And it was for Faye that she had agreed to have her husband removed, believing that once Abakimi was gone, she would finally be able to live the life she dreamed of. But now that the plan had failed, fear haunted her every breath, because she knew that if Abakimi ever discovered the truth, not even her beauty or tears would save her. And while she was busy acting out her false love, Tombra was watching everything quietly, studying Prima's movements, her fake smiles, her nervous glances, and her whispered phone calls. Because Tombra had known from the beginning that Prima was not innocent, and unlike everyone else, she had no intention of letting a murderer walk free. As she waited patiently for the right moment to strike, knowing that revenge, like wine, tastes best when it is well aged. And one evening, as Prima served Abakimi dinner, he reached for her hand with trembling fingers and told her how grateful he was that God had brought him back to her, saying that he believed their love had protected him from death. Words that made Prima's stomach twist with discomfort as she forced a smile and replied that God had been merciful, even though inside she was screaming that God had ruined everything. And later that night, as Abakimi slept, she stepped outside and called Faye in a low voice, telling him that their plan had failed and that they needed to find another way. But Faye, who was growing impatient, warned her that if Abakimi remained alive, their dreams would never come true, a warning that sent chills down her spine, because she was beginning to realize that the web of lies she had spun was now closing in around her. And far from the mansion, Tombra was already making her own moves, placing calls, arranging contacts, and setting traps, because she was not a woman who forgave betrayal. And as night fell once again over the quiet estate, 2 women were preparing for war, one driven by greed and desire, and the other driven by justice and vengeance. And neither of them knew that by the time the sun rose again, everything would change. 1 week after Chief Abakimi's shocking return, the air around the mansion began to feel heavy, as if unseen forces were slowly tightening around everyone inside. And Prima, despite her perfect acting, could not escape the growing fear that followed her like a shadow. Because she knew deep in her heart that a woman who plans death cannot escape its echo. And yet she continued to smile, laugh, and serve her husband with fake devotion. Even as her secret lover, Fea, grew more impatient on the phone, demanding to know when she would finally be free, pushing her to make faster, riskier choices, while Tumbra, who had been quietly observing every move, finally decided that the time had come to pull the rope and watch the liar hang herself. And with calm precision, she called Resho, her trusted enforcer, and told him that the woman who had tried to kill her own husband would now taste the same fear she had caused, instructing him to take Prima that very evening when she went to the market at exactly 5 o'clock, knowing that Prima's love for luxury and routine would make her easy to catch. And as Tombra ended the call with cold satisfaction, she whispered to herself that justice was finally coming. While across town, Prima was humming happily as she dressed up for her usual shopping trip, thinking about the future she still believed she could steal, unaware that danger was already circling her like vultures above a dying animal. And as she drove her expensive car through the busy streets, the sun was sinking low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out for her. And when she finally stepped out of the car at the market, distracted by thoughts of Faye and dreams of escape, 3 men appeared from nowhere, moving with terrifying speed, grabbing her arms and pulling her toward a waiting van before anyone could understand what was happening. And although she screamed for help and struggled like a trapped animal, her voice was swallowed by the noise of the street. And within seconds, the doors slammed shut, sealing her fate. And as the van sped away, Prima realized with horror that she was being taken to the very same unfinished building where her husband had been held, where the walls still smelled of fear and despair. And when the blindfold was removed, she found herself on the same cold, dusty floor, surrounded by men whose eyes held no mercy. And as she demanded to know why this was happening, the kidnappers laughed and told her that her husband would have to pay 70 million naira if he ever wanted to see her alive again, a number so large that it made her knees give way, because she knew Abikimi could never produce such money without selling everything she owned. And back at the mansion, when the news of her disappearance reached Abikimi, he collapsed in despair, crying out to God and begging for mercy, completely unaware that the woman he was mourning had once planned the same fate for him. And as he sat there, broken and afraid, Tombra arrived, wearing the face of a worried niece, offering comfort and gently guiding him toward the decision that would destroy Prima's empire, suggesting that he sell all of Prima's businesses to raise the ransom, a plan that would not only save Abikimi's wife, but also strip her of the very wealth she had killed for. And as Abikimi slowly nodded through his tears, the trap was complete, and the wheels of karma had begun to turn. Prima's world collapsed the moment the iron door slammed shut behind her in the dark, unfinished building, because, for the first time since she had planned her husband's death, she was no longer in control. And as she sat on the cold, dusty floor, trembling in her torn designer clothes, she could smell the same damp cement and human suffering that Abikimi had once described to her. And the terrifying realization hit her like lightning that she was now trapped inside the very nightmare she had created for another human being. And no matter how much she screamed, begged, or cursed, the kidnappers remained unmoved, repeating only one cruel message, that 70 million naira was the price of her freedom. While back at the mansion, Abikimi was drowning in guilt and desperation, pacing the floor, pulling his hair, and blaming himself for every tragedy that had befallen his family. Because he believed that if he had not been kidnapped, Prima would never have been taken. And when Tambra sat beside him, pretending to share his pain, she carefully fed him words that would lead him exactly where she wanted, reminding him that Prima owned several supermarkets, hotels, and properties, all of which could be sold quickly to raise the ransom. And although the thought of losing their wealth frightened him, Abikimi agreed, believing that no amount of money was worth more than the life of his wife. While Tambra quietly smiled inside, knowing that Prima's greatest pride, her empire, was about to crumble. And as deals were rushed, properties were sold at half their value, and money was gathered in panic, Prima sat alone in the darkness, reliving every selfish choice she had ever made, realizing too late that greed had led her here. And when the kidnappers finally brought her a phone to speak to Abikimi, she cried and begged him to save her, her voice shaking with genuine fear for the first time in years. While Abikimi promised her that he would sell everything if that was what it took to bring her home, not knowing that the woman begging for mercy had once signed his death warrant. And as Tambra listened from the side, watching the drama unfold like a carefully directed movie, she knew that the end was near, and that when Prima returned, she would return not as a powerful queen, but as a broken woman with nothing left. By the time the ransom money was finally gathered, Prima's entire world had already collapsed, because every supermarket, every hotel, every piece of land she once proudly owned had been sold in desperate panic. And while she sat chained in the dark room of the abandoned building, she could feel her power slipping away like sand through open fingers, knowing that the fortune she had once planned to enjoy with Fei was now being sacrificed to save her life. And when the kidnappers brought her food and water, they told her, with cruel smiles, that her husband had agreed to sell everything for her. A truth that made her heart twist with shame and fear, because the man she had tried to kill was now the one destroying himself to keep her alive, while Abikimi, exhausted and broken, signed document after document, giving up businesses he had worked decades to build, never suspecting that Tambra was the invisible hand guiding the destruction of Prima's empire. And as the final payment was arranged, Tambra quietly informed Ratio that everything was ready, and that Prima should soon be released, because her punishment was not death, but the humiliation of returning home as a powerless woman. And when the kidnappers finally untied Prima and pushed her back into the van, she believed that her suffering was over, not knowing that her real nightmare was just beginning. And as she was dumped on the roadside and taken back to the mansion, she expected sympathy and comfort, but instead she found whispers, suspicious looks, and a cold distance that chilled her to the bone, because Tambra had already begun planting seeds of doubt in Abikimi's mind, subtly hinting that Prima's kidnapping was strangely connected to his own, and that some women bring danger into the homes they live in, words that slowly began to poison his thoughts. And as Prima walked through her once luxurious house, now stripped of wealth and respect, she felt something she had never felt before, true fear, because for the first time in her life, she was no longer protected by money or beauty, and the truth she had buried was beginning to rise like a corpse from the grave. When Prima finally returned to the mansion, after her release. She expected sympathy, soft words, and warm embraces. But instead, she walked into a house that felt colder than the prison she had just escaped. Because, even though Abikimi stood at the doorway to welcome her, there was something different in his eyes, something wounded and uncertain, as if a quiet storm was building inside him, and Prima could feel it immediately. The invisible wall that had suddenly risen between them, and as servants avoided her gaze and whispers followed her through every hallway, she realized that Tambra's poison was already working, slowly eating away at the foundation of her lies. And though she tried to act normal, laughing nervously and thanking everyone for saving her, the truth was beginning to leak through the cracks of her performance. Because Abikimi could not forget how easily she had moved on during his own kidnapping, how little fear she had shown, and how strangely calm she had been when the kidnappers released him. Doubts that Tambra had carefully planted, now growing like weeds in his heart. And when Prima finally sat beside him, holding his hand as she had done so many times before, her touch no longer comforted him the way it once did, because something inside him was screaming that not all tears are real and not all love is pure. While Prima herself was slowly breaking under the weight of what she had lost, her businesses gone, her secret lover, Fai, silent, and her future uncertain, and in moments of loneliness, she began to realize that the very evil she had released into the world was now turning against her, because every lie she had told, every bribe she had paid, and every prayer she had faked was now being counted by fate. And as Tambra watched her from a distance, she felt no pity, only satisfaction, because she believed that a woman who plans murder deserves to taste the fear of being hunted. And one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with blood-red colors, Abikimi finally asked the question that had been burning inside him, demanding to know why the kidnappers had never called for ransom during his captivity, and why Prima had been released so quickly compared to him, a question that made her heart skip a beat, because she knew that one wrong word could destroy everything. And although she tried to laugh it off, claiming it was all fate and coincidence, Abikimi could see through the weakness in her eyes, realizing that the woman he loved was hiding something far darker than he had ever imagined. And that night, as Prima lay awake, staring at the ceiling, she felt the walls of her lies closing in, knowing that Tambra was no longer just watching, but waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. The night that finally exposed Prima's dark soul arrived quietly, yet it carried more power than any storm. Because, while the mansion slept under the soft glow of moonlight, Tambra was wide awake, carefully arranging the final pieces of the trap she had been building for weeks. And when she invited Chief Abikimi into the private sitting room, he could sense something was wrong by the seriousness in her eyes. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to hear, as Tambra slowly revealed that Prima had not been the innocent victim she pretended to be, showing him hidden phone records, secret money transfers, and contacts that linked her directly to the kidnappers who had once held him captive. Evidence that made his hands shake as if the ground beneath him had vanished, because suddenly every strange detail from his kidnapping began to make terrible sense. From the kidnapper's strange behavior to the silence that followed his release. And when Abikimi called Prima into the room and placed the evidence before her, her face drained of all color, because she knew there was no lie left strong enough to protect her. And as the weight of her crimes crushed her, she collapsed to the floor, crying and begging, finally admitting the truth that she had tried to bury for so long, confessing how she had felt trapped in a marriage that gave her money but no love, how she had fallen deeply in love with another man, Faye, and how her desire to escape had pushed her to do the unthinkable, to secretly hire criminals to kill her own husband. Words that struck Abikimi harder than any physical blow, leaving him shattered. Because the woman he had prayed for while locked in darkness was the same woman who had paid for his death. And as servants gathered outside the room in shock, hearing Prima's broken voice confessing everything, the mansion that once symbolized wealth and power became a courtroom of truth and betrayal. While Tombra watched quietly, knowing that justice had finally arrived, and Abikimi, torn between heartbreak and rage, demanded to know how long she had been lying to him, to which Prima, sobbing uncontrollably, admitted that she had never truly loved him, and that every smile she had given him after his release had been fake, a painful truth that cut deeper than any wound he had suffered during his captivity. And as he realized how close he had come to death because of her greed, he felt something inside him die forever. Because no man can survive the knowledge that the person he trusted most wanted him buried. And when the police were called, Prima tried to crawl toward Abikimi, begging for forgiveness, promising that she would change. But he could only stare at her with empty eyes, because forgiveness was impossible when the heart had been shattered beyond repair. And as the sirens approached in the distance, the reality of her fate finally sank in, that she was no longer the powerful woman who controlled everything, but a criminal about to face the consequences of her actions. And in that moment, as she was led away in tears, Tombra knew that the cycle of betrayal had finally been broken, and that the truth, no matter how long it hides, always finds a way to come out. When the police finally led Prima out of the mansion in handcuffs, the same woman who once ruled the house like a queen now walked with her head bowed in shame. And as the flash of cameras and whispers of the servants followed her, she realized that the life she had built with lies, greed, and betrayal had completely collapsed, because the same hands that once signed business deals and ordered luxury now trembled in fear as iron cuffs closed around her wrists. And Chief Abikimi, standing at the doorway, watched in silence as the woman he once loved was taken away, feeling a pain deeper than the wounds he had suffered during his kidnapping. Because betrayal from a stranger hurts, but betrayal from a spouse destroys the soul. And as Tombra stood beside him, she did not smile or celebrate, because true justice does not bring joy, only closure. And while Prima was driven away to face trial for conspiracy to murder and kidnapping, her secret lover Faye disappeared without a trace, leaving her to face the consequences alone. Just as she had left Abikimi to die in darkness, and over the following weeks, the truth of Prima's crimes spread through the community like wildfire, turning her from a respected businesswoman into a symbol of greed and treachery, while Abikimi, though deeply wounded, slowly began to heal, supported by the same people who had almost been fooled by Prima's acting. And Tombra, having completed her mission, returned to her quiet life, knowing that she had restored balance to a broken world. Because the elders always say that when someone digs a pit for another, they will surely fall into it themselves. And Prima had dug one so deep that she could never climb out again. And as she sat in her cold prison cell, far away from the luxury she once enjoyed, she finally understood that no amount of money or beauty can protect a heart that is rotten with evil. While Abikimi, standing in the sunlight of a new day, thanked God for sparing his life and revealing the truth before it was too late. And though the scars of betrayal would never fully fade, he knew that he had been given a second chance to live, a chance that many never receive. And so the story of Prima became a warning whispered through generations, that love without loyalty is a curse, that greed always demands a price, and that karma, though patient, never forgets.